Afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to give people a minute or so to come into the Zoom, and then we will get started. Sometimes it can be challenging to get your computer to work in the way that you would like. I'm sure everyone has been there at least once in recent weeks. All right, we have a great panel today, so I'm eager to get us started. But first of all, welcome everybody to the Spring 2026 Lunch and Learn series sponsored by Rockefeller College. The intention of this series is to highlight the expertise of our faculty and alumni and to offer some educational opportunities to the broader community about the pressing issues that we are facing today. Today, as I've mentioned, we have a terrific lineup. We will be hearing from Bill Saxonis. He is a Rockefeller alum who started his career at the New York State Energy Office as a policy analyst and eventually came to direct the Energy Office's evaluation unit. He then moved on to the Department of Public Service, where he continued to play an important leadership role in energy program evaluation processes. He has written and published and presented extensively on energy policy, and he is currently teaching in our Department of Public Administration and Policy on energy policy, primarily for our master's students. As an additional part of his life, he is a nationally renowned expert on the life and music of Duke Ellington. You might know me. You certainly got emails from me. I'm the Dean of Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy. But the other hat that I wear is as a political scientist who specializes in law and politics. And I've become very interested in the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on the administrative state in recent years, which has obviously led me to be very interested in questions of law and environmental regulation in the United States. Our third panelist today will be Brian Greenhill. He is an associate professor and serves as the chair for the Department of Political Science here. He is a national expert on how economic and political globalization affect human rights, conflict, and environmental outcomes in the US and in the international system. And he has written and published on international organizations as well. And he teaches in both the political science program and the Master of International Affairs program here at UAlbany. Before I turn things over to Bill to deliver the first presentation, I just want to go over a couple of ground rules that we have for this series. I will ask that you remain muted just in case you have some background noise. We want to make sure people can stay focused on the speakers. We will have some time for question and answer. Once we conclude the presentations, you can read your question aloud by raising your hand. Once we've completed the presentations, but you could also just send it in the chat and I will read it for you. If you would like to submit an anonymous question, you can certainly do that just by sending it directly to me in the chat, and then I will read it without attribution. Or you can use the raise hand function if you like to ask a question yourself. So with that groundwork laid, I will turn things over to Bill.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm glad to be here. We got a great panel, I think. And what we've realized is the times they are changing. And there's my friend Bob Dylan, both young and old. He's going to be 85 years old in May and still touring the world. But the times are indeed changing. We know we had a President Biden from 2021 to 2025, and he said this about climate change. We already waited too long to deal with this climate crisis. We can't wait any longer. It's time to act. And you'll notice that he's actually signing with a pen the executive orders, not the auto pen. And he did indeed act. Under his administration, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed and was expected to provide roughly $369 billion in clean energy and climate priorities. There was a bipartisan infrastructure deal, which was provide funding for a number of different things like electric buses, um, more public transit, etc. We rejoined the Paris Agreement, and he promoted environmentally friendly regulations. But then things changed. And Mr. Trump, during his campaign, he promised to expand fossil fuel production and shred Biden's climate agenda that he repeatedly called the Green New Scam. We're going to drill, baby, drill right away, Trump said. And he meant it. He appointed Energy Secretary as Secretary of Energy at the Department of Energy, Chris Wright. And he is famous for saying, there is no climate crisis. We're not in the midst of an energy transition either. Wright argued that policies aimed at reducing the impact of climate change are misguided and alarmist, describing the terms climate crisis, energy transition, carbon pollution, clean energy, and dirty energy as, quote, destructive deceptions, unquote, and nonsense. Uh, this is kind of interesting. Uh, his background was with an energy company and one of the leading companies involved with fracking. And in 2019, Wright drank fracking fluid on camera to demonstrate it was not dangerous. And there they are having a nice glass of fracking fluid. The Department of Energy webpage made a dramatic change. Here, the front page said, restoring energy dominance. President Trump's day one actions will return the department to regular order. He also appointed Lee Zeldin as EPA administrator. In 2023, as a congressman, Zeldin earned a score of 5% on environmental issues from the League of Conservation Voters. Top score, 100%. And I probably shouldn't mention it, but he's a Rockefeller College political science graduate. On day one, Trump did a series of executive orders. He declared a national energy emergency. He lifted restrictions on Alaskan energy exploration. He limited offshore wind energy. He ended the pause on approval from new LNG exports. He started the process for easing regulations related to oil and gas production while frustrating efforts to address climate change. One of the big things that happened was we got out of the Paris Agreement again. As you know, we've been in, we've been out, we've been in, and we've been out. Climate chaos. This is kind of interesting. Just getting out of the Paris Agreement wasn't enough for Mr. Trump. He also signed a presidential memorandum directing the United States to withdraw from 66 international organizations and treaties, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There were more changes over the last about year and a half, 2025 and 2026. The EPA moved to eliminate more than a dozen regulations governing air pollution, water contamination, and planet warming greenhouse gas emissions, according to a New York Times analysis. More than 1 billion acres of federal land and waters have been offered for oil and gas drilling. The EPA revoked regulations that would have made it more difficult to build more natural gas power plants, repealed subsidies for solar panels and electric vehicles. Federal agencies slowed or stopped federal approvals for new wind and solar projects. Vehicle efficiency standards that would have forced automakers to shift away from gasoline-burning cars have been repealed or blocked. Defunded climate research. Erased scientific data and reports related to climate change from federal websites. Slashed funding and staffing for the National Climate Assessment, the federal government's premier report on climate change impacts on the U.S. That particular report is one of the assignments for my class, and I had a difficult time finding the link for the students because it vanished for a while and it's been relocated, and I actually had to direct my students to an archival site to actually find the National Climate Assessment. This resulted in numerous headlines. For example, in the New York Times, how Trump's first year reshaped U.S. energy and climate policy. Sweeping changes affected everything from coal plant retirements to international diplomacy over shipping emissions. Another headline in February, Trump allies near, quote, total victory in wiping out U.S. climate regulation. Another headline from February, Trump erased a bedrock climate rule. Here come the lawsuits. It's more recent headlines. 24 states sue the EPA for renouncing its power to fight climate change. Locally, Governor Hochul unveils a plan to amend New York's 2019 Climate Act. This is an interesting one. Trump administration to pay $1 billion to energy giant to cancel wind farms. This was a French energy company that had won a contract to build windmills. It was nearly $1 billion. And basically the Trump administration paid them off, and the company in return agreed to some natural gas development projects in Texas. And of course, the war in Iran continues with many energy-related implications, and that's, of course, many news sources. As we probably all know, this is, as of yesterday anyway, the Mobil station near the Uptown campus is now $4.09 for a gallon of regular gas. It was $3.09 just a few weeks ago. But the headlines also continue. Republicans seek protections for oil giants against climate lawsuits. Vermont hits back at Trump's efforts to block climate superfund law. And Trump's budget may target climate programs. I'm just starting to get into the budget, and information has been kind of trickling out over the last several days. Here's a question. What U.S. president said this? This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. Well, this must be a recent president really determined to deal with climate change. Well, here's the answer. It was Lyndon Johnson's special message over 60 years ago. It was in 1965. Energy policy and climate change. Let's put politics aside. What do we know? We know about the foundational science. This was a subject of a lunch and learn that I did approximately a year ago, where we talked about some of the basics of climate change. In the 1800s, scientists discovered that carbon dioxide could alter the Earth's climate. And in 1938, the link between man-made carbon dioxide and a warming trend was documented by Guy Callender. Well, let's look at some real data. Global CO2 emissions are about 186 times higher than in 1850. And according to a report in the BBC based on NOAA data, carbon dioxide levels are higher than any time in the last 800,000 years. And this is some very recent data from Mauna Loa in the observatory in Hawaii, where we see over 10 years, the parts per million for CO2 has indeed increased from about 405 to 431. It's even increased a little bit from 1 year ago. And as you can see, the top number, which is pretty current, March 29th, 2026, it was updated on April 7th. So you might say, well, maybe that data is screwy. I mean, Trump is always talking about fake data and cooking the books and whatever. Well, many of us in the research field like to triangulate data. Here we're looking at CO2 measured at stations around the world. Alaska, Hawaii, the South Pacific, and the South Pole. While there are minor differences, you can see the direction is pretty clear. Okay, those greenhouse gas levels have risen dramatically over the years. But what about temperature? That's the other missing ingredient. Well, Donald Trump said record cold waves were expected to hit 40 states. Really seen anything like it before. Could the environmental insurrectionists please explain what happened to global warming? And this was very recent, January 23rd of this year, 7:19 a.m. Well, this is the 10 hottest U.S. years on record, and the records go back to I guess, to 1901 in this particular case. You will notice that the oldest record is 2006. I point out to my students that all my students, even some of my undergraduate students, have basically lived through the 10 hottest years on record. Well, maybe that's just a local phenomena. Maybe globally it's different. Maybe there's so much, hot air from college professors that the temperature keeps rising in the United States. Well, globally we see a similar chart, the departure in global temperatures from 1981 to 1910. And again, doing a kind of a triangulation check, we look at a number of temperature sources, NASA, NOAA, Hadley Center, Berkeley Earth, and you see this minor variations, but the trend is consistent. And sometimes I wonder if Albany is now Miami on the Hudson, because even here locally in Albany, we're seeing, based on a 1970 baseline, warming winters as well as the other three seasons. And I know we're all complaining about this cold winter, but the reality is, going back again over decades to using a 1970 baseline, our winters are 6.8 degrees warmer. And here's kind of the money shot, the line of temperature and carbon dioxide. You can see that they correspond quite nicely, the rising temperature and the rising carbon dioxide levels. Well, what they did at DOE, they issued a report called the Critical Review of the Impacts of Greenhouse Gas Emissions on the U.S. Climate, trying to create doubt about some of this data. Unfortunately for DOE, a judge just ruled that they failed to hold public meetings or make records available to the public, and the authors often met in secret. And all 5 authors who were selected by DOE and the Trump administration were noted climate change skeptics. A group of 85 scientists issued a 450-page rebuttal report arguing that the DOE report was full of errors and misrepresented climate science. Now, who said this? Climate change is real, human activity plays a major role, and it is one of the major problems facing the world today. The need to address the very real threat of climate change. Maybe the Sierra Club, maybe the National Resource Defense Council, maybe Bernie Sanders. Let's see who said it. Well, look who it is. Darren Woods, Chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil. Just a quick aside, when the first Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement, there was one cabinet member that actually strongly supported being involved with the Paris Agreement. This fellow, Rex Tillerson, was the most vocal voice in the Trump administration. He was, of course, Secretary of State. And what was his job before he became Secretary of State? CEO of ExxonMobil. Now, there can be many opinions on climate change, and certainly when you deal with predictions, as Yogi Berra, the Yankee catcher, said, they're tough, especially if you're talking about the future, because so many ingredients go into modeling and making estimates. What's the economy going to be? What's the population? What's going to be the state of technology? There certainly can be disagreement there. There can be disagreement about how to approach climate change. Some advocate a more active government role. Some advocate more of a free market role. But it's hard to dispute the key facts that we've just reviewed. Just last month, I did a Google search. I put in climate change disinformation, and I got back over 15 million hits. And while I didn't review all 15 million sites, it just gives you an indication in terms of what's going on. And this is a quote that I really conclude with. This is a quote that I really like. It's from the Washington Post circa 1969. Mankind's ability to protect itself is less likely to be limited by inadequate knowledge than by its notorious inability to turn knowledge into effective public action. It oftentimes becomes more politics than real science. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was terrific, and it actually ties in really nicely with a few things that I want to mention. If you are a fan of Alexis de Tocqueville, you might remember that quite a while ago he said that political questions in the United States almost always turn into legal questions. And climate issues are no exception to this rule. So I'm just going to walk through a little bit of what is going on with climate litigation right now. And you can think a little bit about how that intersects with some of the information that you're hearing from the other speakers. First, if you take only two things away from my remarks, I would suggest that you think about the federal government's power to make rules and where that's going, how that's going to go through litigation, and that you keep in mind federalism, the power of the states to control and manage policy questions for themselves, and how that relates to the federal authority to manage things as it sees fit on a nationwide basis. So one of the things that's going on right now is that we have some previous Supreme Court rulings that are having impacts, and as Bill mentioned, some whiplash with the current administration walking back or changing things that the previous administration had done. You might remember that last year the Supreme Court issued a significant ruling concerning the Clean Water Act that limited the scope of that act when addressing wetlands. The EPA has followed up with a proposed new federal rule that really constrains the definition of wetlands so that far fewer waterways are included in that definition and thus subject to regulation. So they're trying to align the EPA's rulemaking with what the Supreme Court was suggesting in Sackett. But the administration has, of course, not limited itself to looking at what the Supreme Court has allowed, and has gone ahead and engaged in rulemaking processes that reflect its perspective on a variety of environmental issues, some of which have already been mentioned, but just to note a couple others. They're currently working on loosening protections under the Endangered Species Act, and requiring a higher standard for granting a complete endangered species protection for threatened species. And then with regard to climate change, the Trump administration has repealed the finding that was made in 2009 that greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare, the so-called endangerment finding. This is really important because the endangerment finding basically put the EPA in the position of having to take action to address climate change and climate pollution. By withdrawing this finding, the EPA no longer has that responsibility, no longer has the requirement to enforce and investigate emissions of greenhouse gases that might cause damage. There is a lot of litigation going on right now. Not all of it is at the Supreme Court level. A lot of important stuff is actually happening in the states. And some of it is sort of suits that are seeking to address climate change directly. Some of it would be suits that are seeking to prevent entities from addressing climate change. So for instance, both New York and Vermont have put into place legislation that creates basically something similar to EPA's Superfund, but on the state level to address the effects of climate change. The Department of Justice is currently suing both New York State and Vermont to try to prevent those laws from going into effect. DOJ is also suing Hawaii and Michigan because Hawaii and Michigan are looking to put into place regulations or indeed to litigate around climate liability to take on greenhouse gas emissions at the state level. You might also have seen some headlines very recently about the Endangered Species Committee's act to exempt oil and gas extraction in the Gulf of Mexico from Endangered Species Act's protection. This threatens a number of endangered species in the Gulf, including rice whales. That will certainly end up in court, no doubt about it. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised to see that filing within the next couple of days. Likewise, California recently passed a law that requires large corporations to report their carbon emissions. Doesn't have anything like requiring them to reduce them, but they want to make those emissions public for corporations that have around $1 billion in net worth. That law is currently on hold. There was an injunction issued against it on freedom of speech grounds. So that's kind of a picture of what this looks like. With regard to the Supreme Court, I just want to quickly mention 3 cases, 2 of which are on the docket for this term, and 1/3 of which will come up in 2026, 2027. So Chevron versus Plaquemines Parish. This is one of those questions that implicates federalism to a certain degree. The states have the authority to regulate coastal waters. That has been clear under US law for quite some time. And Louisiana, which has quite a lot of coastline, has put into effect laws that impose permitting requirements for corporations that are engaging activities that might be damaging to coastal environmental interests. According to the state of Louisiana, Chevron and other oil companies have violated the requirements under Louisiana law for getting permits and complying with permits. So several parishes filed suit against Chevron to get them to back down and obey these state laws. Right now, what's happening is that Chevron wants this case to be removed from the state courts in Louisiana and taken into the federal courts in Louisiana because they anticipate that that will be a more favorable environment for that litigation. Now, that on its surface may sound like it's really technical and procedural. It's going to court either way. The law would be the same. If it goes to federal court, we're still talking about an application of Louisiana law. But if Chevron is permitted to take this action, it will empower similar kinds of actions on the behalf of corporations so that they can try to get any environmental litigation that's going on in the court that they believe will be most favorable to their interests. And the Supreme Court has taken that on and will issue a decision before the summer. Monsanto versus Durnell is another case on the docket right now. John Durnell is a resident of St. Louis, and he used Roundup extensively, as I know probably somebody on this Zoom also does. But he wound up with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he filed suit alleging that his cancer was caused by glyphosate in Roundup. And he made the claim that Monsanto failed to warn him of the risk on the warning label. He had a number of claims in this lawsuit, and ultimately a jury awarded him $1.25 million in damages based on strict product liability. They let Monsanto off the hook for defective design and negligence, but they said basically, this is a product, it injured this person, there was no warning label. So Monsanto has to pay up. Monsanto is seeking to have that jury verdict overturned, not because they claim that it's a violation of the law in St. Louis, but rather that they think that the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act preempts state failure to warn claims because the EPA never issued a rule requiring these kinds of warnings. So again, you see the companies trying to turn to the venue and the set of rules that are going to advantage them. And the Supreme Court will be deciding whether federal preemption plays a role in this case. A case that the court will hear next year, they just accepted cert, is actually more directly substantively consequential. This is Suncor Energy versus County Commissioners of Boulder, Colorado. Colorado has kind of gotten on this bandwagon of suing energy companies in state courts. So basically, several local governments and counties in Colorado got together and created this massive complaint where they're throwing basically every state tort that they can define against energy companies and claiming that their citizens and residents have been damaged by the actions of these companies. So they're claiming nuisance, they're claiming trespass, they're using consumer protection, they're using conspiracy. And the litigation is still at a pretty early stage. So we're not yet at the point of thinking about, are these claims actually valid? Can they prove them factually? But really, can this whole set of claims go forward? And this question went all the way up to the Colorado Supreme Court, which has said, we're going to let this litigation continue. The plaintiffs have created a legitimate cause of action, and they will go forward and see if they can prove their claims in court. Now, Suncor Energy and other energy companies have taken this case to federal court, where they are demanding that the litigation be terminated now based on federalism claims. The idea is that allowing this kind of litigation to proceed, even if it never results in a judgment for the plaintiffs, would have chaotic implications of implying that the states might be allowed to regulate questions that are really more fundamentally issues of interstate and international regulation. So the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this case to decide basically whether or not it can proceed in the Colorado courts. But for the Supreme Court, the first question they have to decide is whether they are empowered to hear the case at this early stage of the litigation. So there's one scenario in which they might say, hey, we're going to have to let this go a little bit further before the energy companies can demonstrate that they have enough of a foreseeable risk of harm that they can continue to maintain this suit in the federal courts. So that will certainly be worth watching. So just a few things that are going on right now. But again, I think what we're seeing right now with the dynamic, the way the federal government's posture is toward environmental regulation, we are seeing more tension between blue states that want to regulate, not even just blue states, right? We have the Louisiana example, but states that want to be able to regulate and are getting pressure as companies that do not want that regulation are turning to federal policy and federal courts to try to make that regulation harder to push forward. So I will turn it over to Brian.
Thanks, Julie. So I'll just add some remarks about the kind of global, kind of international politics perspective on the problem of climate change. But before I do so, I wanted to just emphasize a few contextual factors that I think are important whenever we have a conversation about climate change. One is just to clear up the misperception that I feel many people have, especially when I talk to our students, whereby there's a tendency to see climate change as a kind of all or nothing problem, where either we save the planet or the planet is doomed somehow. What I think is really important to remember is no matter what we do, we are certainly facing the problems right now caused by climate change, and they're only going to get worse in the coming decades if we choose to do nothing. But every little bit that we do to try to improve the situation still makes a difference. And in fact, it makes a very big difference. So I try always to kind of remind my students to sort of get out from this kind of like either climate change doesn't matter and or else there's no point doing anything mindset, and instead thinking about what kind of incremental progress can we do that might help to kind of catalyze other further changes. The other thing to keep in mind is, of course, is that climate change is a global problem. Although the consequences of climate change are felt very differently in different parts of the world and by different segments of society in any given part of the world, it is, of course, a global problem in the sense that we're talking about the average kind of atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. So while the US is certainly a very important player and has historically been until 2006 was the world's largest polluter of or producer of greenhouse gases, we need to also think about the US's actions or inaction in recently in the context of what's going on elsewhere in the world. So for the past 20 years, China has surpassed the US as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And as we all know, China has undergone rapid industrialization in the past few decades. But what's kind of interesting and perhaps gives us some sort of reason for hope is that just last year in 2025, China reported its first ever decrease in the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And while we don't yet know if this is the beginning of it having really peaked and beginning to decline, it nonetheless is an encouraging sign. Other major economies like Japan and the European Union have been well on a path towards decline. Having said that, none of this is to excuse the US's or the Trump administration's complete disregard for the very kind of idea of or the importance of combating climate change. But I think it also serves as a reminder that climate change policy will continue in the background regardless of what the US is doing, even though the US is still a very important player. It amounts for about 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions. What we are sorely missing in the Trump era is the loss of US leadership on the issue of climate. Because certainly under the Obama administration, we saw the US and China together making an agreement to kind of bilaterally commit to lower greenhouse gas emissions, which then in turn in 2015 kind of paved the way for the Paris Agreement. We saw under the leadership of Joe Biden, the US again taking a kind of assertive stance with regard to combating the climate problem. And now under the Trump administration, we're seeing just a complete disregard for the kind of basic science of climate change. So that loss of leadership will have an effect that goes beyond just the contribution that the US makes, but will kind of slow or seems to already be slowing momentum for trying to tackle the problem of climate change at the intergovernmental level. The other kind of contextual factor that I wanted to kind of draw everyone's attention to is the fact that in recent years, particularly in the past 10 years or so, we've seen really dramatic changes in energy markets to the point where now renewable sources of energy are price competitive with fossil fuels. So this has very much kind of changed the logic. And again, I certainly don't want to suggest that this means we have nothing to worry about anymore. But what this means is that the kind of logic of the climate denying community is kind of suffering in a way that it wasn't maybe 10 or so years ago. So while the Trump administration can do all it can to try to kind of incentivize further fossil fuel extraction and to try to move or try to create disincentives for the switch towards renewable energy, to a large degree, the market kind of speaks for itself. And one of the kind of interesting things that we've been watching in recent weeks has been obviously with the US and Israel's war in Iran, to see what impact that is going to be having globally on the energy transition. And again, that's something that we can kind of argue both ways. On the one hand, you could say, well, this shows that countries want to, or kind of perhaps even more dependent than we had previously recognized on certain key fossil fuel providers, as we've seen with Iran's blocking of the Strait of Hormuz. But now we're also seeing a kind of renewed push on the part of many countries in the world to try to kind of wean themselves off dependence specifically on Middle Eastern oil, but also to try to move away from fossil fuels more generally. We saw in Europe in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine and we experienced a very significant energy shock at that point, that many European countries kind of began to kind of accelerate their transition towards renewable sources of energy. So one might argue, even though this is a little bit of a stretch, that perhaps one kind of silver lining to come out of the war with Iran is it serves as a kind of wake-up call for many countries in terms of trying to kind of push them further towards their decarbonization goals. Finally, one other thing I wanted to just touch on a little is the role of AI, artificial intelligence, in all of this. So as Bill already mentioned, with this massive kind of technological revolution that we're going through right now, it's for the time being at least is creating a massive new demand for electricity. In fact, I recently saw a prediction that by 2030, AI data centers will use as much electricity as the entire country of Japan. Okay, and keep in mind that Japan is the world's fourth largest economy. So the amount of demand for energy right now is going through this massive increase. So the critical question will be, will that demand be met through dirty sources in the form of fossil fuels, or will it be met through clean renewable sources, in which case its overall effect on climate will be hopefully much less bad than it may otherwise be. I think I'll wrap up my comments there, but during the Q&A that's going to follow now, I'll be happy to answer any more questions that people have about the impact of Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Terrific. Thank you, Brian. So you did answer, I think, one of the questions that came in prior to our talk. So I'm going to focus on the questions that we have in the chat first. The first is from Joel Harmon, talking about the EPA's mission statement. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the current version of the EPA's mission statement. It doesn't explicitly make this shift, but I think if we look at the executive orders that have come out and we look at the actions that the EPA itself has taken with rulemaking, it does underline the observation that you have here that EPA is focusing in its own terms more on economic impact. I think Bill can speak to this as well, but one point that I would make is that if you think about what the EPA is doing is focusing on economic impact, it's actually a pretty narrow understanding of economic impact, because climate change is going to have tremendously damaging economic impacts. We have been seeing that every year with increasing significance over the last several years. I think we could just mention very quickly the bills that have accumulated for things like hurricanes, floods, fires, storms, etc. And that certainly is not going to get any better if there's no action on climate change. And of course, all of these impacts have devastating human consequences as well. Bill, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things is that through the endangerment finding, which has basically been rescinded by EPA, basically takes EPA out of the regulatory business as it relates to climate change, and that's really groundbreaking. And I know the Trump administration is crowing that it's the biggest regulatory reform in bazillions of years, but they clearly are going in a different direction. totally different direction in terms of why EPA was created and what they're currently doing. And on the legal front, during the first Trump administration, the National Resources Defense Council, which is a major environmental group, I believe they participated in, I think it was 163 legal cases during the first Trump administration. And certainly the endangerment finding has caused a lot of uproar. There's a number of environmental groups that are challenging it. Many state attorney generals, including Tish James from New York State. So it's going to be it's an exciting time. And I mean, there was a time that environmental cases, didn't take up that much time of the courts. But certainly in recent years, it seems like almost everything to do with the environment somehow or other winds up in court. And there are also some bigger issues as well, like the role of the federal government through things like the Chevron doctrine, where some argue that unless it's explicitly written in the legislation, various agencies really can't do anything about it. And that is kind of troubling if you believe that you shouldn't allow Congress to be engaged in every little detail of every little action. And so there's a lot of things going on. I mean, in terms of teaching a course in energy policy, climate change, which I've done since 2017, I'm constantly rewriting the course, constantly rewriting my lectures. I mean, the example, we're in the Paris Agreement, we're out of the Paris Agreement, we're in the Paris Agreement, we're out of the Paris Agreement. It's hard to keep track of. And but anyway, it keeps me on my toes anyway.
Yeah, just picking up on what you mentioned, this is another place where federalism becomes important because the silver lining that environmental activists and some attorneys general are finding in what's happening, they're saying, all right, fine, the EPA is stepping back out of this space. They don't want to have any regulatory authority there anymore. Okay, if federal government is stepping back, then that opens up room for the states to step in without fear of preemption. Now, of course, we have energy companies arguing that no, you can't do that for supremacy reasons, and they'll probably try to push forward other kinds of arguments. But that there are certainly arguments out there that regulatory space can be filled by some entity. If the federal government's not going to fill it, then the state should be allowed to do so. But we have another question here, an important one, maybe more of a point, about the impact of militarism on the climate and the recognition that the way that we think about emissions globally does not incorporate the emissions that take place in the pursuit of military training and other military activities. I don't know if you can speak to this, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I think it's definitely an interesting and very important point. I mean, remember too, in the context of US GDP, the total size of the US economy, our military spending ranges from somewhere between about like 3% to 5% of GDP. And given how huge the US economy is, it's perhaps not surprising that the military constitutes a very large part of our greenhouse gas emissions. So that's even just under normal circumstances. Of course, during times of active war, that's only going to make things much worse in terms of destruction, the amount of kind of energy used in that and so on. I'd also just kind of encourage, I know this wasn't the original question, but I'd also just encourage the audience to also think about the kind of flip side of this too, which is one other thing that is definitely on the radar screen of many military planners is to think about what impact climate change is likely to have on global security in the future. Because one thing we do know for sure is that climate change is causing changes in the way in which people interact in the world that have military significance. So, for example, the melting of the the polar ice cap at the North Pole is going to kind of open up shipping routes between North America and Asia in a way that may be good in terms of speeding up the time taken to transport goods, but will also have very significant geostrategic implications and could therefore cause, a greater kind of scramble for access to resources or for military dominance in the Arctic region. Similarly, climate change we know is going to have kind of really tragic impacts on many people in very poor parts of the world where, vast numbers of people live very close to the oceans and where rising sea levels will cause large-scale displacement of people, and that this will lead to even greater refugee flows than we've seen in the past 10 or 20 years. And it's almost anyone's guess what kind of political and security implications might arise as a result of large movements of displaced people. So, the kind of irony is that despite the Trump administration's kind of insistence that climate change is just a scam and it's this made-up problem, the US military has for many, many years been thinking very seriously about the problem of climate change because, regardless of what our politicians may say, it is going to have very real-world effects on how the military is planning to respond to the challenges that we'll be seeing in the coming decades.
I would just add, Brian, that the Department of Defense, I guess now it's the Department of War, has come out with a couple of reports over the years that dealt with many of the issues that you talked about. And the other issue that they talked about was the level of risk that different bases around the world of the United States are at. I mean, many of them are located along the coast. Well, what impact will rising sea levels have on that? Plus the issues that you just mentioned, like if uh, food supplies are devastated in a country and there's migration and whatever, what does that mean for world stability, that sort of thing. But they did do a couple of reports. They've been pretty much kiboshed by the Trump administration. But if you search around on the web enough, there's some archive site or something that you can usually find them.
Mhm. I would just add too that when I was talking earlier about the issue of dependence and how, what many climate activists are perhaps kind of somewhat excited at the idea of thinking about how the clean energy transition can be a way for countries to become more energy independent. We do, of course, also have to kind of temper that optimism by realizing that certain countries are going to have a disproportionately large influence in how we carry out this clean energy transition. So, for example, China has emerged in recent years as, really the leader when it comes to like the manufacture of photovoltaic panels for solar energy and so on, also for battery technology. And so many countries' economic dependence on China will, at least in the short term, appear to be kind of even larger than it currently is. So one could argue that we'll see not so much a move towards energy independence, but maybe more of just a kind of realignment of these relationships of dependence in ways that, from a US policy point of view, are, certainly kind of unfortunate for the US if, as a result of this kind of climate denialism that we're dealing with right now, that the US kind of ends up forgoing the opportunity to be a more important player globally in this time of energy transition.
Thank you. We have one last question that we might be able to grab really quickly about Governor Hochul's push to postpone implementing climate protection laws. We know that she is in the middle of a re-election campaign, and in a certain sense, she might be between a bit of a rock and a hard place, as she has one wing of her party pushing her to do something about costs, which is always of interest to the electorate. But many on the left are very, very concerned to see the proposal to hold off on moving New York more quickly toward energy transition. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I have some thoughts about it. Actually, initially, I thought when the Climate Act was passed, I thought the goals were a little bit too ambitious. I mean, it's good to set ambitious goals, to kind of drive the movement forward. But I thought it was a little bit overly ambitious. Having worked at the Public Service Commission and being involved with rate cases and utility operations and whatever for a long time, I know how complicated an energy transition is. And it's not that I don't think the goals were worthwhile. It's just they may have been a little bit overly optimistic. And I think the governor, between a rock and a hard place, is a good way to express it because she's also making a push for affordability. People's electric rates have gone up substantially over the last couple of years. I believe the number is $1.8 billion is in arrears of New York State utility customers. And AARP just did a survey where they were saying that something like 17, 18% of people over 50 years old are cutting back on things like their medication and whatever, trying to keep up with the bills. And we know that an energy transition is going to cost money to upgrade lines, to bring in new equipment. There was a NYSERDA report that just came out recently. I guess it was supposed to be a private report, but got leaked to the press, where they were talking about an additional, I think it was like $2.30 a gallon for the cost of gasoline. This is on top of the current price. So if it's 409 now, that would be plus $2.30. If I mean, it's modeling, it's projections. It's hard to say exactly. But I think she's in a very difficult position. I think she's probably doing the right thing. I think it needs to be tweaked. And I think a lot of people, even on the environmental side, are realizing that some of these goals are just a little bit too ambitious.
Thank you.
I
Again,
should point out just quickly, one of the guest speakers I have coming into the class is Marie French, and she's the energy reporter for Politico and does a fabulous job covering New York and New Jersey. And she'll be coming into my class on the 27th of April, I believe. And if there's anyone that knows what's going on with the Climate Act and what's going on with the legislature and the governor, it's Miss French. And if there's anyone that's interested in sitting in for at least part of my class when she's a speaker, just send me a note just so I know you're not like a burglar or something.
great. Well, we are actually at time right now. I wanted to take just a moment, obviously, to thank everybody for spending your afternoon with us and hearing from our terrific experts. We have a final lunch and learn for now scheduled on April 22nd, where we will hear from Senior Executive Director of the School of Criminal Justice, John McCluskey. He's going to talk about the work that he has been doing on police body-worn cameras and AI review, to rather controversial issues brought together in one talk. So I hope you'll be able to join us. And obviously we'll be keeping our eyes on the news, and hopefully we won't have to do an emergency lunch and learn on anything terrible in the next several weeks. But once again, thank you so much for your support. We do appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.